Hey, it's Mike here, and today 5 major myths that people use to deny climate change or that it is driven by humans. So we're gonna rebut a bunch of climate denial claims using research and logic when it is necessary, and all of the links will be in the description below as usual. All right, let's go. For some background on the opinion in the US at least, Yale University has been doing an ongoing nationally representative survey for about a decade now. From their most recent measurements, about 70% of the US now believes climate change is real, and 60% believe that it is primarily driven by humans. We now have 5 times more climate believers than we do deniers, but there's still a sort of loud minority of people in the US that do deny it. And from this survey of 23 large countries, the US comes in 3. There are only 2 countries that have more climate deniers than us, and one of them is Saudi Arabia. About 50% of their GDP comes from fossil fuels. All right, now let's hop right into our first myth, which is that climate change is not driven by humans because it's just a natural cycle, that the climate is always changing. And this really is the newest, most relevant iteration, the notion that, yeah, something is happening, fine, that's proven, but you should feel fine just spewing all of the CO2 out of every orifice anyway. Okay, that's not how most people emit greenhouse gases. But to deconstruct this notion, first we have to ask, zooming out, are humans even capable of changing our climate? Well, we know for a fact that from refrigerants, we were able to destroy our atmosphere to a certain extent to create that weak spot in the ozone. The next important question is, could we as humans emit enough CO2 to actually raise the CO2 levels of our atmosphere? Part of the answer comes from studying ice cores, CO2 levels trapped within ice throughout history. We can look at the layers and tell how old it is. This gives us this timeline of CO2 levels, hundreds of thousands of years back, and we can see that we had a natural fluctuation, and boom, we just shot right past that. I meant shot. Or did I? Could it be that after hundreds of thousands of years, right in the exact century that we have boosted our population by about 7 billion, that this is just a random spike in CO2? No. And in case you think it's just that the Earth is so big that we can't affect it, I mean, just look at a picture of the Earth at night. All of those little blobs are like the tailpipes of humanity just spewing out CO2. If you were an alien rolling up to Earth and you saw all of these lights, you'd be like, oh my gosh, something is happening here. This planet is clearly inhabited by a CO2-producing species, which is on a fast track for self-destruction. Hey Norb, pass me the space crack. In case you just want to see some numbers, here is a chart of CO2 emissions by country over time. You can see that some countries have totaled emission levels of around hundreds of billions of tons. That's insane. And for the final piece of the puzzle, would increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere actually even trap more heat? This has been proven on many levels, the most compelling of which is the satellite measurements that we've been doing since the 70s of the amount of radiation, the amount of heat that has been entering the atmosphere, leaving the atmosphere. And that's from this study. And they have, quote, direct experimental evidence for a significant increase in the Earth's greenhouse effect. So we can see the massive emissions of CO2 from humans. We can see the ridiculous, non-normal spike of CO2 levels, and we can measure the increase in heat capture. And finally, looking at CO2 levels and global temperature from NOAA data, it's clear looking back hundreds of thousands of years again that they are intimately connected, ridiculously so. And if you're not somebody that really cares about studies, you just like things like visuals and what's happening in the world, you can't look at footage like this of the melting ice caps on a massive, massive scale and say, oh yeah, that just happens normally that fast. It doesn't.
It's as if the entire lower tip of Manhattan broke off, except that the thickness, the height of it, is equivalent to buildings that are 2.5 or 3 times higher than they are. It took 100 years for it to retreat 8 miles from 1900 to 2000. From 2000 to 2010, it retreated 9 miles. So in 10 years, it retreated more than it had in the previous 100.
Now for another more modern myth is that, yeah, climate change is happening, I agree, but it's just not gonna be bad. Like, it's not gonna actually hurt us. Or really that, yeah, maybe down the line it'll be bad, but it's not changing fast enough to be hurting anybody. In fact, we'll just adapt. And along with this notion, there's a lot of like, we don't care about other species. If they go extinct, that's their problem. They weren't adaptable. But us humans, we're super smart. Even if we have crazy storms all the time, we'll just live in superdomes. It'll be great. Superdome G5, day 4,735. Today we had extra good algae slop goop stuff. And the highlight of my day was probably, I think I saw an ant crawling on the glass of the dome. But, you know, I'm just trying to stay positive. And I think there's a good lesson that we can glean from history, and I'm talking like way back, like 250 million years ago, when there was, some relatively slow climate change compared to what we have today, yet we had a mass extinction rate. 90% of species went extinct in what is known as the Great Dying. How did it happen? Well, the going theory appears to be that there was a volcanic eruption that increased the amount of nickel in the ocean. A particular methane-loving organism was able to bloom from that. That was the nutrient it was missing, created a ton of methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, and then it warmed the planet to the point where over 60,000 years it killed almost all life. And according to this study, during that time period, we were seeing about a 1 degree Celsius rise every 6,000 years. Well, from this NASA chart, you can see we've had about a 1 degree Celsius rise in the last 100 years. In other words, we're warming about 60 times faster than the time when almost all life was wiped out from global warming. Natural cycles, though. Natural. And I would add, just because it's part of a natural cycle doesn't even mean we want to let it happen or let it happen faster. For example, the Ice Age sucked. Half of North America was covered in ice. We don't want that. I don't want that. And this is where the terms global warming and climate change don't really do rapid climate change justice, because we end up getting climate breakdown. We have all sorts of effects, from droughts to floods to a ton of shifting weather patterns that make the world less hospitable. And when we're looking at something like more intense storms, we're not just guessing that this is going to happen. We can actually calculate it. We have something called the Clausius-Clapeyron equation, which measures vapor and how much water it can hold. And it turns out that for every Celsius degree rise, we can hold about 7% more water in the atmosphere. That's not just an equation that was invented by a bunch of hippies that are trying to trick you into getting solar panels. No, it's just a general equation used for vapor. All right, moving on. And changing rain patterns can just make everything more chaotic. It can also make droughts last longer. From this study that looked at tree rings, they found that droughts have, in fact, been getting worse as the climate changes. And looking at all these negative effects, some scientists have gone as far to map out globally where we are most vulnerable as a species. And as you may have guessed, quote, populations contributing to the most greenhouse gas emissions on a per capita basis are unlikely to experience the worst impacts of climate change, satisfying the conditions for a moral hazard in climate change policies. That means that people in the US will be externalizing their negative climate impacts to other countries with lower income. In terms of whether or not climate change will be dangerous to us, we also need to keep in mind that we can reach sort of points of no return. We might have environmental triggers that happen, such as the frozen methane in the ocean getting to that melting point where it then emits a bunch of that really powerful greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, which could accelerate things. And there are enough potential negative effects that people have made documentaries and documentaries on them. But let's just move on to the next point. Point number 3, that there is no scientific consensus on climate change. There's been a clear concerted effort to undermine scientific consensus on this topic. It's no surprise, going back to the Yale survey that found that 25% of people in the US believe that there is a strong disagreement among scientists on global warming. You've probably heard the 97% figure, that 97% of scientists believe that climate change is driven by humans. Of course, this has been outright denied.
And I'll mention that the stat about the 97% of scientists is based on one discredited study.
The 97% figure that's thrown around, the head of the UN IPC said that number was pulled out of thin air. It was based on a survey of 77, not even 97 scientists responded to that survey. So let's talk about facts.
Okay, he's probably referring to this older survey from 2009, but this is the important study, which actually came out 2 years before both of those dudes were talking in 2015 interviews. It did exist. It looked at 12,000 studies between 1991 and 2011. They found that 97% of studies that expressed a position endorsed human-driven climate change. And to check their work, they got a hold of about 1,200 of the authors who self-rated their own papers positioned. Again, 97% said they endorsed human-driven climate change. 1,200 is a lot more than 77. So no, this figure was not discredited. Climate deniers have latched onto their own statistic. In this case,
there was a survey done of 1,800 scientists, and 57% said they don't buy off on the idea that CO2 is the knob that's turning the climate. There's hundreds of reasons for climate change.
I don't know what ass you're pulling that out
I'm not.
Well, it came from this Dutch study that asked a ton of questions, one of which was, are you 95% or more confident that climate change is driven by humans? So if you were 93% confident, if there's such a thing, then you would be counted as a no, at least in their interpretation of the study. But here's the thing, if you know anything about scientists, you know they hate absolutes. All right, next question. Are you 95% or more certain that you are a human? Look, now it's really hard to prove anything. I would say that I'm maybe 80 to 90% certain. Look, for all we know, we are floating blob brains in a simulation. Hasn't been disproven. He also totally misinterpreted that CO2 knob point. In fact, from this chart, this is the percentage of scientists that believe there is moderate to strong warming from natural variability, and this is moderate to strong warming from greenhouse gases like CO2. Totally bogus interpretation. But there are a lot of other conclusions you can draw from the same study that you're not going to hear from these people. How 91% of them said that they were either concerned or very concerned about climate change. The problem is that that one particular study arbitrarily stratified the scientists into a bunch of crazy different categories, and therefore making the study very easy to misrepresent. And we have to look at what type of scientists we're talking about as well, because, for example, a cytologist or someone who's studying cells might not spend a lot of time looking at the climate data, even though they're a scientist. So it makes sense that you can have an oft-cited petition like this with thousands of scientists saying that they don't think climate change is human-driven. First of all, it's called into question whether or not that was signed by actual scientists. Secondly, you can find thousands of people that will basically say anything today, but the question is, what do the climate scientists believe, the ones that spend their life focused on this issue? And yes, that original study did look at climate scientists, and other studies like this one that looked at top publishing climate scientists also found about 97 or 98%. So while we can see consensus in non-climate scientists, we have it where it matters the most as well in those climate scientists. All right, let's move on to the next one, which goes back to the basics of global warming, but this is still mentioned a surprising amount of times, and that is that, oh, it's kind of cold right now. The weather's been cold, therefore global warming isn't real. This is an issue of weather versus climate, and we have to look at the official definitions of both of these words. Firstly, we have weather. The state of an atmosphere at a place and time as regards to heat, dryness, sunshine, wind, rain, etc. And then climate is the weather conditions prevailing in an area in general or over a long period. So weather is what's happening within a short period of time. Climate is what's happening within a long period of time. And this connection doesn't go both ways, actually, because weather can be determined by climate. So just to reiterate, well, climate can change weather. A single weather event cannot change the climate. Therefore, climate change cannot be debunked by weather events. All right, moving on to the last myth, myth number 5, that this whole climate change thing has just been manufactured by Big Green or the solar lobby, or going further that, that those scientists are just in it for the money. So on one side, we have this sort of conspiratorial notion that there's this evil cabal of corporate renewable energy scientists just cooking the books. And on the other hand, you have the less out there notion that just because scientists make money off of this, they're trying to perpetuate their own industry. All right, firstly, the reality is that a much, much larger industry has actually been caught doing this, and that is the fossil fuel industry. For example, oil giant Exxon has known for decades that their product, fossil fuels, would increase the CO2 level of the atmosphere and increase the temperature of the Earth. Here's a graph from an internal memo from the company in the 80s. It has the same projections that people claim are bogus and biased from climate scientists. Yet despite this, they have spent millions of dollars funding climate denial think tanks to change public opinion and lobbyists to influence policy. And at this point, I think it's good to hear directly from a climate scientist. Here is Catherine Hayhoe from the University Texas Tech.
Greed is only one of the accusations that are hurled at us scientists on a nearly daily basis. Why? I think it's the idea that if you discredit the messenger, you can silence the message. Sometimes we're accused of selling out to Big Green. Big Green, really? Oil and gas companies are 5 of the biggest 10 earners in the world, and none of the top 10 are green energy companies.
She explains how a grant of over $1 million got funneled down to basically no one's making any extra money. Some students are getting like a measly salary, and that's it.
And I ended up with about $2,000 left over each year. First year, I bought my student a computer. Year 2, I paid for them to go to a scientific conference. And in years 3 and 4, I paid for us to publish a scientific paper each year.
She also goes on to say that she had a colleague at her university who was studying climate scientists, then got offered way more by the oil companies and left to work for them.
He loved working at the university, but the oil company had made him an offer too generous to refuse.
And finally, from a logical perspective, saying that scientists get paid to study climate change, therefore climate change isn't real, just makes no sense. Just because someone's getting paid for something doesn't mean it's automatically a lie. You know, if this were the case, it would mean that anybody that has ever been paid in any amount ever, therefore, is wrong about everything. There's also a connected notion here that climate scientists have been exaggerating, and therefore the whole thing is a hoax. So when you get one study that says, hey, judging by our numbers, CO2 might not be warming the Earth as much as we thought previously, then you get people saying, climate doomsday just got canceled. Of course, that's relying on one study by one group of scientists who could be wrong, but let's assume that they're right. So a doubling in CO2, instead of giving us a 4.5 degrees Celsius rise, maybe it gives us a 3 degrees Celsius rise. First of all, 1.5 degrees is super risky, and 2 degrees could lead to major food shortage issues. That is why the target is to stay under that in terms of the Paris Accord. That doesn't negate the effect, and that doesn't change what the best strategy would be to keep as many people as possible safe. Not all scientific estimates are going to be 100% spot on all the time, but that doesn't mean the overarching theme is wrong. To prove how whack this logic is, so if we underestimate something in terms of climate change, that means it automatically has to be true, right? Well, climate change effects are exceeding projections in many areas, including ice melt. But let's entertain the idea that there's some wacky scientists out there that are exaggerating for attention or money or whatever. That still doesn't prove that climate change isn't happening or that it isn't driven by humans. Here's an example. Looking to the case of the Titanic, Captain Edward Smith was warned that he was going too fast in the dark, that there were icebergs around, yet he kept on going hella fast. I think we know what happened next. But let's say somebody did exaggerate. They were like, hey, Captain, there's literally an iceberg the size of Manhattan directly in front of the ship. You need to stop. Then the captain was like, oh, Terrence exaggerating again. There's clearly no iceberg right in front. I'm gonna go twice as fast now. Little bitch, Terrence. Because Terrence exaggerated, does that mean that there was no iceberg in front of them that they eventually would have crashed into? No. This whole line of reasoning is illogical, dumb, and not a reason to ignore climate change. Now I have a final point I want to add on here, because for every person who's denying climate change in general, there's also somebody who's an environmentalist that is completely denying the effects of animal agriculture on the planet. Environmentalists are always talking about SUVs and transportation. Well, from the FAO's report on the subject, the livestock sector emits as much as all transportation combined, or more than all transportation combined, depending on which report you're looking at. So this is a massive issue. In addition, we are feeding up to half of the world's grain using about 1/3 of the Earth's fresh water and about 30% of our ice-free land, our best land to raise livestock. This makes us less capable of responding to the climate disasters and feeding the population. You get the idea. In the end, when talking about these 5 big myths, it's clear that people's opinions are not based at looking at the actual data. They're not based in the literature. But that makes sense because people don't usually form their opinions by combing through the peer-reviewed literature. Their opinions are formed tribally, or because their behavior is convenient, they continue to believe that it's good. Thankfully, from Pew Research, the majority of the planet appears to believe that climate change is a serious issue. And after this video, if you're still doubting this whole thing a lot, I would say just because we haven't proved something 100% doesn't mean we shouldn't take the safest, most effective route to prevent danger. I mean, that's our policy on terrorism, clearly. So why isn't it our policy with the entire planet? All right, that's it for today. Feel free to let me know what you think down below. Let me know if I missed any myths, and feel free to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next video.